I'm Brooke Mitchell, 31, and I've always been protective of my little sister Allison. When she married Richard Foster, her intimidating boss, at that fancy Boston venue last spring, I knew something was off. Throughout the entire celebration, Richard deliberately ignored me, shooting dismissive glances whenever our eyes met. He had no idea I knew his secret. During his pompous wedding toast, I stood up and said one sentence that made his champagne glass freeze midair. His face went pale instantly. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for what comes next. Growing up, Allison and I were inseparable despite our 3-year age gap. Our parents worked long hours at their family restaurant, so I naturally fell into the role of her protector. I braided her hair before school, helped with homework, and chased away the neighborhood kids who teased her about her braces. We shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams. When she cried over her first heartbreak at 16, I was there with ice cream and terrible romantic comedies until she smiled again. After college, I built a solid career as a financial auditor for the Securities Regulatory Commission. My job involves investigating potential fraud cases and ensuring companies follow proper financial protocols. It's detail-oriented work that suits my analytical mind, and I've developed a reputation for thoroughness that's earned me several promotions. My colleagues respect my ability to spot inconsistencies others miss. Allison took a different path. While I gravitated toward rules and structure, she thrived in creative environments. After graduating with a marketing degree, she bounced between jobs, struggling to find her niche until 2 years ago when she landed a position as marketing director at Foster Investments, Richard's rapidly growing firm. "He's brilliant, Brooke," she gushed during our weekly Sunday brunch shortly after starting the job. "Everyone says he's the next big thing in investment banking. He started the firm just 5 years ago, and they're already managing billions." I nodded politely, but something about Richard Foster's meteoric rise triggered my professional skepticism. In my experience, overnight success stories in finance often had complicated backstories. Allison and Richard's relationship evolved quickly from professional to personal. At first, she mentioned him casually, compliments he'd given her marketing proposals or his impressive client presentations. 6 months later, they were dating, despite my gentle reminders about office relationships being complicated. "It's different with us," Allison insisted. "He's not like other bosses. We're equals outside of work." The whirlwind romance accelerated at an alarming pace. After only 8 months of dating, Allison called me screaming with excitement about the massive diamond on her finger. Richard had proposed during a weekend trip to his family's estate in the Hamptons. "Don't you think this is moving a little fast?" I asked carefully, twisting the straw in my iced tea as we sat at our favorite cafe the following weekend. "When you know," she replied, her eyes bright with a happiness I hadn't seen since before our parents passed away. Richard is everything I've ever wanted. Successful, thoughtful, ambitious. I tried to be supportive, truly. But something about Richard made me uneasy whenever we met at family gatherings. He spoke exclusively about himself, interrupted Allison constantly, and had a way of subtly undermining her opinions that made my protective instincts flare. Allison's friend Melanie Carter, who became her maid of honor, shared my concerns. "He's a bit controlling," she whispered to me during the engagement party. Did you notice how he corrected her story about how they met? Like he couldn't bear for anyone to hear her version. My friend Natalie Wilson, who attended the same party, noticed too. "That guy has serious ego issues," she texted me afterward. "The way he keeps name-dropping his wealthy clients is exhausting." The situation became more complicated when I ran into Jason Thompson, my ex-boyfriend from college, at Allison's engagement dinner. I nearly dropped my champagne glass when I saw him. "What are you doing here?" I asked, genuinely confused. "I work for Richard now," Jason explained, looking uncomfortable. "Investment Analysis Division." I've been there about 6 months. That was the first I'd heard of Jason working for my future brother-in-law, despite my regular conversations with Allison. When I mentioned this to her later, she seemed surprised. "Oh, I thought you knew. Richard hired him from Goldman Sachs. He says Jason is one of his best analysts." The pieces weren't fitting together. Jason had always worked in regulatory compliance, not investment analysis. His presence at Richard's firm raised new questions, but Allison was too caught up in wedding planning to notice my growing concerns. 2 months before the wedding, I tried one last time to voice my reservations. "Are you absolutely sure about Richard?" I asked Allison during a dress fitting. "Something about him just doesn't seem right." Her face hardened. "Just because you analyze fraud for a living doesn't mean everyone has something to hide, Brooke. You've never even given Richard a chance." "He makes me happy. Isn't that enough?" I backed off immediately, recognizing the hurt in her voice. Perhaps I was being overprotective, letting my professional paranoia seep into my personal life. For Allison's sake, I decided to try harder with Richard. She deserved my support, not my suspicion. As the wedding approached, I made genuine efforts to connect with Richard. I attended every pre-wedding event with an open mind, determined to see what Allison saw in him. At the engagement brunch hosted by Richard's parents, I approached him with a warm smile. "I'd love to hear more about how you started your firm," I said, offering an olive branch. "Allison says your growth has been impressive." Richard glanced at me while swirling his mimosa. "It's pretty complicated stuff. Not sure it would make sense unless you're in high-level finance." "I'm a financial auditor," I reminded him. "I might follow better than you think." "Right, for the government," he replied with a dismissive chuckle. "Bit different from what we do in the real world of finance." Throughout the remaining engagement parties, this pattern continued. Richard would acknowledge me briefly before finding reasons to speak with someone else. When conversations turned to my career, he'd make subtle digs about government inefficiency or regulatory overreach. At a family dinner 6 weeks before the wedding, he referred to my agency as the hall monitors of Wall Street, while his business friends laughed. Allison either didn't notice these interactions or chose to ignore them. When I brought them up, she'd sigh. "He's just stressed about work, Brooke. The firm is going through a big expansion phase." The rehearsal dinner proved particularly tense. Held at an exclusive Boston restaurant overlooking the harbor, the evening should have been perfect. I was seated at the family table but noticed Richard had placed me at the opposite end from him and Allison. When I stood to give my toast as Allison's only sister, Richard checked his watch 3 times during my 5-minute speech. Later that evening, I excused myself to the restroom and accidentally overheard Richard speaking with his business partner, Thomas Anderson, in a quiet hallway near the bar. "Allison's sister is becoming a problem," Richard said in a low voice. "She keeps asking questions about the firm." "Is she suspicious?" Thomas asked, sounding concerned. "She's a nobody government auditor," Richard replied dismissively. "But she's nosy. After tomorrow, I'll make sure Allison sees less of her." I froze, pressed against the wall, my heart pounding. The conversation confirmed my worst fears about Richard's character, but also triggered professional alarm bells. Why would he be concerned about my questions unless there was something to hide? The next morning, while helping Allison with wedding preparations, I received an email from my colleague Derek at the commission. It was flagged urgent. "Need to talk ASAP. Review flagged Foster investments. Potential irregularities in their Q3 filings." "Isn't that your sister's fiancé's firm?" My stomach dropped. The commission had sophisticated algorithms that flagged suspicious patterns in financial reports. If Foster Investments had been flagged, there was legitimate cause for concern. I stepped away from the bridal suite and called Derek. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked quietly. "Inconsistent profit reporting, unusual cash flow patterns." The system also flagged some offshore transfers that don't match their declared international operations. Nothing concrete yet, but enough to warrant a closer look. I thanked him and hung up, feeling sick. My professional and personal lives were colliding catastrophically. If Richard's firm was engaged in financial misconduct, my sister was not only marrying a dishonest man, but potentially becoming legally entangled in his schemes. That evening, I called Natalie in a panic. "What do I do?" I asked, pacing my hotel room. "If I tell Allison now, she'll think I'm trying to sabotage her wedding. If I don't, and there really is fraud happening, do you have actual proof of wrongdoing?" Natalie asked practically. "No, just suspicious patterns and the system flags," I admitted. "The investigation hasn't officially launched yet." "Then maybe wait," she advised cautiously. "Don't ruin what should be the happiest day of her life based on suspicions. But keep your eyes open." I agreed reluctantly. Without concrete evidence, accusing Richard would only alienate Allison. I decided to keep silent, hoping desperately that my professional paranoia was overreacting and the flags in the system would prove to be innocent anomalies. As I fell into an uneasy sleep that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow's celebration would bring more than just a wedding. The morning of the wedding dawned with picture-perfect weather. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the bridal suite as makeup artists and hairstylists transformed Allison into a vision in white. Her happiness was radiant, infectious, making my concerns feel distant and abstract as we prepared. "You look stunning," I told her truthfully, blinking back tears when she emerged in her gown. The fitted bodice gave way to a flowing skirt adorned with hand-sewn pearls, elegant and timeless, just like Allison. "You think Richard will like it?" she asked, suddenly vulnerable despite her beauty. "He'd be a fool not to be completely breathless," I assured her, pushing away my doubts for her sake. The idyllic mood shattered when Richard's mother, Eleanor Foster, swept into the bridal suite. Eleanor was a formidable woman, tall, immaculately dressed in designer clothes, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and calculating eyes that missed nothing. "Allison, darling, you look acceptable," she said, surveying my sister critically. Though I still think the Vera Wang would have photographed better for Vogue. Then her gaze landed on me, and her polite smile thinned. "Brooke, that bridesmaid dress is interesting on your figure." I bit my tongue, reminding myself this was Allison's day. "Thank you for the beautiful venue, Eleanor." "It's gorgeous." "Yes, well, when Richard said he wanted a small wedding, I had to intervene. Fosters don't do small anything." She looked around the room dismissively. "Where are the mimosas? A wedding without proper champagne is hardly civilized." As the bridal party assembled for photos before the ceremony, Richard arrived for the couple's first look. He was undeniably handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his confidence magnetic as he embraced his groomsmen. When he turned and saw Allison, his reaction seemed genuine, his eyes widening, voice catching as he told her she was beautiful. Yet during the family photos that followed, I noticed a pattern. Richard subtly maneuvered me to the edges of every group shot, sometimes whispering directions to the photographer that relocated me behind taller family members. In several key photos, I was positioned so far from Allison that we weren't even in the same frame. "Could we get one with just me and my sister?" I requested during a break. The photographer looked to Richard, who checked his watch. "We're running behind schedule. Maybe during the reception." That photo never happened. The ceremony itself was breathtaking. Vaulted ceilings adorned with hanging floral arrangements, string quartet playing softly, hundreds of candles illuminating the historic church. Watching Allison walk down the aisle on our uncle's arm, I felt a complex mixture of love, pride, and apprehension. After the vows were exchanged and the newlyweds processed out, we moved to the reception at the Grand Wellington Hotel. The ballroom had been transformed into a romantic wonderland with crystal chandeliers, white orchids cascading from ceiling installations, and tables draped in silk. As I entered the cocktail hour, I searched for my place card at the family table. After several confused minutes, a coordinator directed me to a table near the kitchen entrance, clearly not with family and bridal party as tradition dictated for the bride's only sister. There must be a mistake, I said, showing her my title in the program, Sister of the Bride. The seating chart was finalized by Mr. Foster himself this morning, she replied apologetically. I'm not authorized to make changes. I retreated to the bar, fighting back angry tears when a familiar voice spoke behind me. They did you dirty with that table assignment. I turned to find Jason, looking uncomfortable in his groomsman attire. Jason, hi. Enjoying the party? I forced a smile, not wanting to discuss the seating drama. Listen, Brooke, he said, lowering his voice. I need to talk to you. It's about Richard's firm. My professional instincts immediately sharpened. What about it? Not here, he murmured, glancing around nervously. Meet me on the terrace in 20 minutes? I nodded, suddenly forgetting about seating charts and photo placement. 20 minutes later, I slipped onto the terrace, finding Jason in a shadowy corner away from other guests. I've been wanting to contact you professionally for weeks, he began without preamble. But with you being Allison's sister, it's complicated. What's going on, Jason? He pulled out his phone. I was hired by Richard because of my regulatory background. I think he wanted someone who could help skirt reporting requirements without technically breaking laws. But what I've found goes way beyond gray areas. He showed me a series of spreadsheets and documents. Even in the dim lighting, I could see what had alarmed him: evidence of systematic misrepresentation of assets, fabricated performance reports, and troubling international money transfers. This looks like textbook securities fraud, I whispered, my professional training kicking in. And possibly money laundering through these Cayman accounts. That's what I thought. I've been documenting everything discreetly. Richard suspects nothing. He thinks I'm completely loyal. Why are you showing me this now at their wedding? Jason's expression grew serious. Because they're leaving for a 2-week honeymoon tomorrow, and Richard mentioned cleaning house while they're away. I think he's planning to destroy evidence. As I tried to process this information, I noticed several wedding guests watching our intense conversation with curiosity. I recognized Richard's business associates, looking at us with suspicion. I should get back inside, I said quietly. Send me these files securely. I'll make sure they reach the right people at the commission. Just as Jason agreed, I spotted Richard across the terrace, his eyes narrowing as he took in our private conversation. He whispered something to Thomas, who immediately started walking in our direction. I quickly rejoined the reception, my mind racing. The professional implications were clear. I had an ethical obligation to report what Jason had shown me. But the personal consequences would be devastating. Allison would be humiliated, heartbroken, and possibly implicated if she had unknowingly participated in any of Richard's business dealings. For the first time that day, I questioned whether staying silent had been the right choice. Perhaps ruining the wedding would have been kinder than allowing Allison to bind herself legally to a fraud. The reception reached its full swing as twilight deepened outside the grand ballroom's windows. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over ice sculptures, towering floral arrangements, and a string quartet playing softly in the corner. Despite being relegated to a distant table, I made my way toward Allison, determined to at least congratulate her properly. She looked radiant, greeting guests with Richard by her side. Her eyes lit up when she saw me approaching. "Brooke, isn't everything magical?" she exclaimed, pulling me into a quick hug. "I can't believe we pulled it off." "Everything is beautiful," I agreed, genuinely happy to see her joy. "You're the most gorgeous bride I've ever seen." Richard cleared his throat. "Darling, your father's old business partner is waiting to speak with us." He nodded curtly in my direction, not bothering with a greeting before steering Allison away. Throughout dinner, Richard made a point of publicly acknowledging everyone in Allison's life, thanking our elderly aunt for her special wedding quilt, recognizing our uncle who had walked Allison down the aisle in our father's absence, even mentioning Allison's childhood piano teacher who had sent a congratulatory letter. Everyone except me, her only sister, her closest family. Is something going on between you and Richard? Asked Mrs. Henderson, our mother's best friend, who was seated at my isolation table. I would have expected you to be sitting with the family. I forced a smile. Just a mix-up with the seating arrangements. She replied, clearly unconvinced. Seems odd. Your parents would have wanted you right beside Allison today. The mention of our parents sent a pang through my chest. They would have seen through Richard immediately. My father, with his straightforward business ethics, would have investigated Richard thoroughly before allowing the relationship to progress. My mother would have noticed how he subtly controlled Allison's movements, choices, and social interactions. After dinner, I finally managed to approach Allison alone while Richard was speaking with some investors. Her cheeks were flushed from champagne and dancing, her eyes bright. Hey sis, I said warmly. Having the time of your life? Absolutely. Though I've barely had a chance to eat anything, she laughed. Listen, I wanted to ask you something. Before she could continue, Richard materialized beside her. He looked me up and down with a dismissive smirk that made my skin crawl. Allison, darling, the Andersons are leaving. We need to say goodbye, he interrupted, as if I weren't mid-conversation. Oh, I was just talking to Brooke about. The Andersons manage over $50 million with us, Richard cut in. They can't leave without a proper goodbye from both of us. As he led Allison away, I caught the apologetic glance she threw over her shoulder. It was a familiar expression, the same look she'd given me repeatedly over the past year whenever Richard interrupted, dismissed, or spoke over me. I retreated to the bar, where Melanie found me nursing a gin and tonic. This is messed up, she said bluntly. Everyone's noticed how he's treating you. Even my boyfriend asked why the bride's sister is sitting near the kitchen instead of at the head table. I don't want to cause a scene, I replied, watching Richard holding court across the room. This is Allison's day. Is it, though? Melanie asked pointedly. Because from where I'm standing, this looks like Richard's show and Allison is just his co-star. Before I could respond, Allison waved us over to join a group conversation with some of Richard's colleagues. I approached cautiously, aware of Richard's eyes tracking my movement. So as I was saying, I heard Richard explaining to the group, the new tax structures actually benefit certain investment strategies if you know how to structure the holdings properly. That sounds fascinating, I said, genuinely interested in the financial discussion. At the commission, we've been seeing a lot of creative interpretations of those regulations. The group fell awkwardly silent. Richard's jaw tightened. Brooke works for the Securities Regulatory Commission, he explained to his colleagues, his tone making it sound like I collected garbage for a living. Allison's sister, he added, as if that explained my presence. What exactly do you do there? Asked one of the men, seeming genuinely interested. I'm a senior financial auditor, I began. We investigate. She shuffles paperwork. Richard interrupted with a laugh. Now, about those offshore opportunities we were discussing. I stood there, completely cut off mid-sentence, as Richard redirected the conversation. Allison gave me another apologetic look, but said nothing to correct her new husband's rudeness. As I walked away, humiliated, I spotted Thomas and Richard huddled in an intense conversation near the cake table. Their body language caught my attention. The furtive glances, Richard's aggressive gesturing, Thomas's nervous head shaking. I circled around, pretending to admire a flower arrangement while straining to hear their exchange. Has to be handled tonight, Richard was saying firmly. I don't care what it takes. It's your wedding night, Thomas protested. Surely it can wait until. Nothing can wait, Richard hissed. I want the situation contained before we leave for Bora Bora. Am I clear? Thomas nodded reluctantly. I'll handle it. As they separated, my phone vibrated with multiple incoming messages. I slipped into a quiet hallway to check, finding urgent texts from Derek at the office. Emergency meeting called for tomorrow morning. Foster Investments investigation officially greenlit. Direct evidence of fraud received. Are you involved with this case? My heart raced. Jason must have sent his evidence directly to the commission. The investigation I'd suspected was now reality, and it was moving quickly. Another text came through. Brooke, you need to distance yourself from this case immediately. Family connection is a massive conflict of interest. I leaned against the wall, suddenly dizzy. In less than 24 hours, my sister's world would implode. Her new husband would likely face criminal charges, their assets would be frozen, and the media would turn their fairy tale wedding into a public scandal. When I returned to the reception, the DJ was announcing dinner was complete and the formal toasts would begin. Richard had grown increasingly drunk throughout the evening, his confident smile now amplified into something arrogant and loose. He clinked his glass repeatedly, calling for attention with the entitled air of someone who always expects to be heard. As he stood to begin his toast, he caught my eye across the room and shot me a triumphant look, the satisfied smirk of someone who believes they've won completely. In that moment, watching Richard prepare to play the role of adoring husband while knowing what I knew, something crystallized inside me. This wasn't just about securities violations or my wounded pride. This was about my sister's future, her safety, and the inevitable heartbreak that awaited her, whether I spoke up now or remained silent. The ballroom fell silent as Richard tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. Cameras flashed, capturing his confident smile as he began his toast. Standing at the head table with Allison beaming beside him, he looked every inch the successful businessman and devoted husband. Distinguished guests, family, and friends, he began smoothly. Today has been nothing short of magical, watching my beautiful bride walk down the aisle toward our future together. His practiced charm worked its magic on the crowd as he continued with flowery sentiments about love and partnership. I watched Allison's face, noting how she gazed up at him adoringly, completely unaware of the house of cards they stood upon. I want to take a moment to thank those who made this day special, Richard continued. To Eleanor and Richard Sr., thank you for raising me with ambition and vision. To Thomas, my best man and business partner, we've achieved the impossible together. He proceeded to thank Allison's uncle for walking her down the aisle, her cousins for their support after her parents' passing, and even Melanie for being such a dedicated maid of honor and friend to my wife. The deliberate omission of my name hung in the air. Several guests glanced uncomfortably in my direction, recognizing the slight. Allison's smile faltered slightly, but she remained silent beside her new husband. And of course, Richard continued, his voice taking on a subtly different tone, I must acknowledge how fortunate Allison has been to find success with our company, proving that talent and dedication are always recognized at Foster Investments, regardless of background or connections. The implication was clear to anyone paying attention, that Allison had earned her position through merit, while suggesting others might rely on nepotism or shortcuts. His eyes flicked briefly toward me. Some people, he continued, his voice lowering conspiratorially as if sharing a private joke with the room, spend their lives checking boxes and enforcing petty rules, never understanding what it takes to build something meaningful, to create real value. Scattered nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Those who knew I worked in financial regulation understood exactly who he was targeting. I sat perfectly still at my distant table, face burning but expression neutral. But enough about small thinking, Richard smirked, raising his glass higher. Today we celebrate ambition realized. Foster Investments continues its unprecedented growth, with expansions into 3 new international markets next quarter and projections that will stun our competitors. My phone vibrated again in my clutch. Another message from Derek. Evidence suggests imminent destruction of documents. Commission seeking emergency warrant. Richard was now making a joke about how Allison had initially resisted his advances, describing her early reluctance in a way that painted her as naive and himself as persistent and ultimately victorious. Something about his characterization made my skin crawl, the subtle positioning of her independence as an obstacle he'd overcome. And I must say, he added with a theatrical wink toward his groomsmen, it's particularly satisfying when the unattainable finally recognizes the inevitable. More uncomfortable laughter. Allison's smile had become fixed, her eyes darting briefly toward me as if seeking reassurance. So while some family members might not approve, Richard continued, his voice hardening slightly as he looked directly at me for the first time all day, perhaps out of jealousy or simply an inability to recognize genuine success when they see it. The room grew awkwardly quiet. The best man, Thomas, shifted uncomfortably beside Richard. Even Eleanor Foster looked surprised by her son's overtly hostile tone. I think we can all agree, Richard plowed on, raising his glass higher, that the sad, single sister working her government job shouldn't worry about those who are clearly thriving beyond her limited understanding of achievement. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Allison's face drained of color. Richard, she whispered, audibly enough that nearby guests could hear. That's enough. But Richard was too far gone on champagne and arrogance to register her distress. To my beautiful bride, he declared triumphantly, who had the wisdom to align herself with success rather than mediocrity. The moment stretched before me like an eternity. I saw Allison's mortification, Jason's knowing look from across the room, Melanie's outraged expression, and most clearly, Richard's smug certainty that he was untouchable. The weight of the evidence on my phone, the investigation launching tomorrow, and the devastation awaiting my sister regardless of my choice, it all crystallized into perfect clarity. I stood slowly, my chair scraping loudly in the awkward silence that followed Richard's inappropriate toast. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward me. I think everyone should know, I said, my voice steady and clear despite my racing heart, that as of 9 a.m. tomorrow, your firm is being investigated for securities fraud and insider trading, and I have the evidence right here. Richard's champagne glass froze midair. His face, flushed with alcohol and triumph just seconds before, drained to an ashen gray. The confidence in his eyes gave way to naked fear as he registered my words. Complete silence descended over the reception. 200 guests sat motionless, looking between Richard's frozen figure and my calm stance. Allison's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. You're lying, Richard finally managed, his voice strangled. This is pathetic, Brooke. Trying to ruin our wedding because you're jealous. The Securities Regulatory Commission doesn't launch fraud investigations based on jealousy, I replied evenly. They do it based on evidence. Evidence like falsified performance reports, hidden offshore accounts, and manipulated client funds. Thomas Anderson abruptly sat down, looking ill. Several of Richard's business associates began whispering urgently to each other. Richard? Allison's voice was small, uncertain. What is she talking about? Richard's eyes darted wildly around the room, likely calculating how many of his investors were present, how many potential witnesses were recording this moment on their phones. This is absurd, he attempted, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow and desperate. Brooke has always resented my success. This is a pathetic attempt to undermine me. Is that why Jason Thompson, your own employee, submitted evidence to the commission yesterday? I asked, nodding toward Jason, who stood firmly despite the attention now directed his way. Is that why your partner Thomas looks ready to pass out right now? Because this is all in my imagination. The room erupted into chaotic murmurs. Eleanor Foster rose shakily from her seat, her aristocratic composure crumbling as she looked between her son and the disintegrating celebration. I hadn't planned this moment, hadn't intended to create this public scene. But watching Richard's carefully constructed facade collapse before my eyes, I recognized that sometimes the truth demands to be spoken, regardless of timing or social niceties. Allison stood now too, her wedding gown shimmering under the chandelier lights, as she took a step away from Richard. Tell me this isn't true, she demanded, her voice stronger now. Tell me my sister is wrong. Richard's silence was damning. The elegant reception deteriorated into chaos within minutes. Guests whispered urgently to each other. Phones appeared as people searched for news about Foster investments, and several of Richard's business associates made hasty exits, no doubt rushing to check their investments or contact their lawyers. Richard recovered enough to launch a desperate counterattack. "This is slander," he shouted, pointing at me accusingly. "You're manipulating the situation because you've always been jealous of Allison. You'll be hearing from my attorneys tomorrow." "Richard, please," Allison pleaded, her voice trembling. "Just tell me if it's true." "Of course it's not true," he snapped, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "Your sister has always undermined our relationship. This is just her nuclear option." Jason stepped forward, surprising everyone. "I submitted the evidence to the commission myself," he stated clearly. "Performance reports were systematically falsified. Client funds were diverted to offshore accounts. I documented everything." Thomas, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly bolted for the exit. Two men I didn't recognize, but who had the unmistakable bearing of federal agents, intercepted him discreetly near the door. "This is ridiculous," Richard sputtered, looking increasingly cornered. "Jason is a disgruntled employee. He was about to be fired for incompetence." "Then explain why the commission's algorithms flagged your Q3 reports," I countered. "Explain the irregular cash flows and the accounts in the Cayman Islands that don't match your declared international operations." Allison swayed slightly, reaching for the table to steady herself. "You told me those accounts were for legitimate tax planning," she whispered. Richard's face contorted with rage. "This is my wedding day. How dare you bring your petty government witch hunt into my celebration?" "Our celebration," Allison corrected quietly, tears now streaming down her face. "It was supposed to be our celebration." Eleanor Foster swept forward, her designer heels clicking purposefully across the dance floor as she inserted herself between Richard and Allison. "This is outrageous," she declared, focusing her icy glare on me. "The Mitchell family has always been jealous of success. Your sister married above her station, and now you're trying to drag Richard down to your level." "Mrs. Foster," I replied evenly, "the commission doesn't care about social stations. They care about investor protections and federal securities laws." "Show me this so-called evidence," Allison demanded suddenly, her voice stronger than I'd heard it all day. She extended her hand toward me, wedding ring catching the light. I deserved to see it for myself. I hesitated, then nodded, retrieving my phone and opening the secure files Jason had sent. I walked to Allison, conscious of every eye in the room following my movement. As I approached, Richard lunged forward, attempting to intercept the phone. "Don't listen to her manipulations." But Allison stepped away from him, creating distance for the first time that day. She took my phone with trembling hands and began scrolling through the documents. Her marketing background hadn't prepared her for complex financial analysis, but even she could understand the highlighted discrepancies, the massive differences between reported and actual numbers, and the incriminating emails from Richard to Thomas discussing how to create the narrative our clients need to see. "These are your emails," she whispered, looking up at Richard. "This is your signature on these wire transfers." "Business is complicated," he blustered. "You're looking at normal operations taken out of context. Is that why you've been telling Thomas to handle the situation tonight?" I asked. "Because everything is above board and normal?" Richard's face contorted. "You were spying on me?" "At my own wedding." "I overheard you," I corrected. "There's a difference." Allison continued scrolling, her expression growing more horrified with each document. "There are clients I know personally on this list," she said, her voice hollow. "People who trusted you with their retirement funds, their children's college savings." Richard's mother attempted damage control, addressing the stunned guests. "A small misunderstanding between family members," she announced with a brittle smile. "Please continue enjoying the celebration while we sort this out privately." But it was far too late for privacy. Several guests were already on their phones, no doubt contacting their financial advisors if they had investments with Foster. Others were clearly recording the unfolding drama. Richard, seeing his carefully constructed world crumbling, made a desperate move toward the exit. "This is absurd. I'm calling my attorney." As he attempted to push past several guests, the doors to the ballroom opened, revealing 3 individuals in suits who I recognized instantly as colleagues from the Commission's Enforcement Division. Derek, my direct supervisor, nodded grimly in my direction before approaching Richard. "Mr. Foster," he stated formally. "I'm Derek Williams from the Securities Regulatory Commission. We need to ask you some questions regarding Foster Investments." "You have no authority here," Richard snarled. "This is my wedding." "We have a warrant," Derek replied calmly, producing an official document. "And we have reason to believe evidence relevant to an ongoing investigation may be destroyed tonight based on communications we've intercepted." Richard looked wildly around the room, perhaps searching for an escape route or ally. His eyes landed on Allison, who stood clutching my phone, her wedding dress now seeming like an elaborate costume in a play that had taken a dark turn. "Allison," he pleaded, suddenly sounding vulnerable for the first time. "You know me. You know I wouldn't do anything illegal. Your sister has manipulated this situation.